Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you guys are hearing this from. This is a webinar series that World Bank provides on various emerging topics around the world development issues. My name is Seung Kim. I'm a consultant working on the cloud computing assessment projects, which we will be talking about today. And today's speaker is Amanda Jensen, and she works for the Accenture, one of the world champions in this particular area. Amanda has been doing extensive consulting work on cloud computing for the last 10 years. So with no further introduction, let me toss the microphone over to Amanda, today's speaker.
Thanks. So I wanted to start out today's presentation by giving a quick overview of what is cloud. So the best way to potentially think about cloud is like a thermostat at work. So it gives you the ability to use resources as you need them. So when it's too hot, you can turn down the temperature. When it's too cold, you can turn up the temperature. In the same way, you can get resources when you need them, as many as you need, and then when you don't need them anymore, you can release them. So I worked with Sun Yoon on a project where we tried to develop a toolkit that would help various countries review their own readiness for cloud. And
Amanda, can you hear us? Amanda? Sorry, folks, we are having some technical problems, so we'll be sorting this out as soon as possible. So while we are fixing this technical issue, so let me give an overview of this projects. This is a technical assistance project, and it's funded by the Korean government trust fund. And we launched these projects last November, starting by hiring Accenture, like I said, one of the best, the champions, one of the champions, available out there in the world. And we try to come up with a toolkit that gives us the ability to assess the high-level assessment and the recommendations for action plans for cloud migrations. And we did develop that toolkit early this year. And with that, we did a pilot study for 3 countries. One is Serbia, and one is Zambia, and the last one is Philippines. So Amanda is going to give the overview of this cloud computing and overview of this toolkit that we developed, and also give the overall high-level findings and the lessons learned from our pilot studies. So Amanda, can you hear us?
I can. I could always hear you. I think you guys lost me.
Yeah, we lost you momentarily. I mean, can you go on, please?
Yes, by all means. So thank you, Sun Yoon. That was an excellent overview. So basically, as Sun Yoon said, we put together a toolkit that would help these governments assess their cloud readiness. We focused primarily on 2 components. The first was just at the country level. How ready were they for cloud. What were some of the gaps they had? Where were those gaps? And then also at an application level, we put together a questionnaire that would help them look at their application portfolio and assess which applications they should consider moving first to cloud, etc. So we developed this, and then Sun-Yoon and Samia worked with the various country managers to determine which countries would be the best locations to pilot this toolkit. And they identified 3 excellence countries. They picked Serbia, the Philippines, and Zambia. And they primarily picked these 3 countries because they covered a range of population, different digital adoption indexes, and other factors that the World Bank was looking for, and thought that they would be good candidates for this pilot. So once they selected those, we then took the toolkit there, and then we performed 3 pilots and then assessed the countries based on the toolkit. So covering the toolkit in a bit more detail. So as I said, there were 2 components to this. There was a country assessment and then the application assessment. We realized pretty quickly that the application assessment is an excellent second step for countries to use. So once they've decided that they are in fact ready to go to the cloud, then they could, then use this secondary questionnaire to identify which applications they might want to use or to start with. But in the early stages, most countries just weren't there yet, nor did they wish to share that kind of information with the World Bank or really anyone outside of the government. So taking that into account, the toolkit it's still going to be part of the toolkit and made available to the countries, but ended up not being included in the pilot findings per se. The other thing was the country assessment. So this was extremely popular and well received by the countries. It's a series of questions. It's a little over 100 questions, and they're separated into categories. So the categories are general, resources, so specifically skills. Do the countries have the skills in security and cloud and in IT in general that would really prepare them for a move to the cloud? Security, regulation, governance of information and communications technology systems, data, so both where it's stored and how it's classified. So, do they have things in place now to determine what data is sensitive? Do they have rules around handling sensitive data? And then lastly, infrastructure. So, do they have the existing pieces in place that they could implement this themselves? An excellent example of this was Zambia. So Zambia needed to focus first on infrastructure, as less than 20% of their government offices, even inside the capital, were connected to the internet. So if you're not connected to the internet, then implementing a cloud offering is further down the roadmap for a country. So we separated all the questions into these categories, and then each question has an associated score with it. So even within a category, certain questions have more weight associated with them, and all of those weights up to 100. So then we can give you a score both at the category level and then at the overall level for your country. And I have a slide that shows kind of what that looks like. So in the top right, you can see that's the recommendations broken down by the different categories. And then there's also the readiness metric or matrix that shows at a very high level, at the category level, where your key strengths and also the key areas to work on. And then it also provides the actual questionnaire provides some automated recommendations. So based on the answers to the questions, you'll get specific recommendations about what the next step should be. And it could be anything from, if somebody gives an answer of I don't know or unknown, then the recommendation could be as simple as, investigate what your country has in terms of this capability, to much more specific recommendations around security and some of that. The primary reason that the recommendations table was put together, and it's a fully automated macro-driven recommendation table, is because the World Bank wanted a toolkit that they could post online and that anybody could download and use without having to have people go there and help them fill it out. So it's supposed to be a completely self-contained toolkit, right down to the recommendations. And you can even continuously reuse it. So as situations change for governments, as their answers change, they can go back into the questionnaire, update their answers, and then when they click on the recommendations tab, that tab will be updated accordingly. Now, that said, the recommendations take into account the fact that the specifics of the situation cannot be known by a 100 questionnaire or 100 question questionnaire. So they are going to be relatively general. Even some of the more specific ones are still high level, because without knowing the specific security and infrastructure issues that each country faces, there's only so much depth this questionnaire can go into. If anyone has any questions as we go along, feel free to ask. So the application and infrastructure questionnaire, just to dive into that, so even though it wasn't used during the pilots themselves, this will also still be available online. These questions are also divided into categories, but they're focused more on the technology standpoint. So you've got an architecture section, a general section, operation, optimization, and security. And all of these are much more technical questions geared towards the applications. So specifically, what operating system are you using? Do you have documentation for this specific application, etc.? And then this also gives much more detailed reports once all that information has been added. So it provides specific effort and fit percentages, as well as a specific deployment model recommendation. So basically, this cloud has confidential classified data on it. It's probably not a good fit for the public cloud. The toolkit would recommend a private cloud type thing. And then you can tweak, so users can always tweak these answers and weightings based on their own personal situation. And then at the bottom, you can see this was one of our favorite charts. It basically takes all the applications in the portfolio and kind of shows at a high level which are the best fit for a cloud. So where you might want to start, where you could get some quick wins, and then where you have more, these would require effort but could be relatively quickly implemented. And then lastly, candidates that are outside of one of the three circles are ones where you might want to consider doing something else. So contemplating replacing the item, decommissioning it, etc. So then our overall findings at the country level. So we went to 3 countries, Serbia, the Philippines, and Zambia. We expected things to be much different than we discovered that they were. So Serbia and the Philippines had much closer scores than we had originally anticipated. And one of the things that we definitely discovered was that Zambia had a lot of potential. So they didn't have a lot of things in place, which gave them a lower score, but they were doing a lot of things to try and they were asking exactly the right questions and trying to put the right pieces in place before they moved forward. So that also raised their score overall because they did have some of those key pieces of regulation in place. As you can see there, their score in the regulation area was actually a little higher than the Philippines. From a deployment model finding, for all 3 countries, we ended up recommending a private cloud. In this case, this was primarily due to geographic location. So both Serbia and Zambia were unclear whether their data could leave the country. Because of this, one of the recommendations that we gave to them was that they needed to kind of reevaluate that and decide if that was the rule, if data couldn't leave the country, or if they were willing to let it leave the country, and what would be the security requirements, et cetera, around that. So there's no right or wrong answer for them, but it's something that right now was kind of ambivalent to the actual employees working for the government, and it was making it difficult for them to make decisions as to what options they had available to them and what they should pursue from a cloud roadmap perspective. The other thing was public servers. In all three countries, we were told that classified data or personally identifiable information could not be stored on public servers. So again, if that's true, then you cannot pursue a public cloud option because you cannot put your data on any sort of a third-party system. So we can also delve specifically into the findings. I'll try and show them to you at a high level. And if you're interested further, we can always discuss offline, or we can discuss it after the presentation's over. The greatest weakness for Serbia was definitely in governance of ICT systems. One of the big things that we discovered there was that they had made a lot of inroads to digitizing things, but they still had a lot of rules in place saying that certain pieces of documentation and certain elements of processes had to exist in written form. So because of this, even as they were starting to automate things and starting to put e-governance into place, it wasn't going as smoothly as it could, because partway through the process, you'd still have to have the physical written document. So that was one of our recommendations to them, was to look into that. Security was definitely a concern. They did not have a lot of IT security resources. They also didn't have as many regulations around encryption and data protection as we would like to see. So some of those recommendations were made as well. For the Philippines, we saw very similar things, including the paper requirements. One of the additional things we saw there, though, was additional confusion as to where exactly data could be stored. So some people had started storing data outside of the country, and we raised that as a concern that if that wasn't a path that they wanted to pursue, they needed to put the appropriate rules and regulations in place, because people were starting to do that. And then with Zambia, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key areas there was definitely from an infrastructure perspective, but that was something Zambia was already aware of and was moving towards resolving. So I think I think we can open it up to questions. Senyun, if you're okay with that.
Amanda, I think you skipped the couple of slides showing the basic concept of cloud computing and
Oh, yes.
models, right? I mean, I think you assume that we might be running out of time at the end, or every people attended is free familiar with this concept. But I think the giving like 2 or 3 minutes on explaining this basic concept wouldn't hurt. Yeah.
Certainly. I also think I may have given part of it to myself when I got disconnected from you guys. Okay, so cloud computing at a very high level. There's an official National Institute of Standards and Technology definition that basically references the fact that it's an ever-present, on-demand network that enables users to have access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources. But what does that mean? So basically, there's 5 elements that comprise cloud computing. Those are resource pooling, on-demand self-service, rapid elasticity, broad network access, and measured service. So a good way to think of this is both, so multiple analogies provide kind of some better information here. So as I briefly mentioned at the beginning, I'm not sure if you guys caught this or not, was thinking about it from like a thermostat perspective. So from a resource pooling and rapid elasticity, you've got, if actually an even better analogy would be, most people are familiar with Gmail and other elements of the internet. So if you've got a lot of people that need access to resources, but that the number is going to change. So actually the example I love to give is Pizza Hut on a Super Bowl Sunday. So they're going to get significantly more orders on Super Bowl Sunday than they are any other time of the year. So something like a cloud environment would enable companies that have kind of those spikes in demand and enable them to basically better utilize resources. So if you're, a Pizza Hut or a tax accounting firm or somebody that's got a lot of spikes in demand, then cloud computing can kind of help with that. So when you need resources, they're available to you. And when you don't need them, then you can kind of release them and other users can use them during times that they need them. So using government examples, if you're a tax group, then you might only need those resources whenever your tax day is. But if you're, say, the EPA or your equivalent environmental protection agency, you might need additional resources at a different time of year, maybe when you do certain modeling or run certain tests. So if that can all be balanced across, then instead of the tax group having the maximum number of servers for their needs and the EPA having the maximum number of servers for their needs, but only using maybe 10 or 15% the rest of the time, then you can kind of combine that and you can more effectively utilize your resources. So that's one of the benefits of cloud computing. We're talking about some of the other stuff. So say on-demand self-service. An area there, the primary advantage there is that if I'm a user and I work for any company that has cloud computing, let's say the World Bank, and I have this great idea for this application that would really change the lives of people in countries across the world, then I can actually go out to a cloud and say, I would like some space, some computing resources so that I can develop this application. And rather than having to, call up Best Buy and say, I would like a server and I need an operating system and a database and all this other stuff, you can actually just simply request those services, and then those requirements will be met and an environment will be provisioned for you, and you can go out and you can build your amazing application, and you can even deploy it and make it available to other users, all without having to have done those steps, the additional steps of buying a server and setting it up, etc. So it also greatly speeds up your time from having your brilliant idea to actually implementing it and going live. Now, that said, one of the things we have to keep in mind for governments is somebody still has to buy those servers. So either at the government level, there has to be some national data center, or they have to have access to some, third-party public computing system. So the resources have to exist somewhere, but from a user perspective, you have much more flexibility to implement the things you want and to also grow or shrink them as needed. Frequently, it's also associated with measured service. So I only have to pay for what I'm using. So instead of paying for the entire server that my application is running on, I only pay for the CPU usage and memory and storage that my particular application takes up space-wise. And then, of course, as part of cloud, you're required to have broad network access. So if you cannot access the environment outside of your specific location, so if you cannot access it outside of your office building or outside of your home, then that's not on demand, and available as per the definition of cloud computing. So there's multiple. Oh, sorry.
No, go on. So you're going to say deployment models. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's several different possible deployment models that governments and other organizations can consider. So private cloud is when you own the cloud environment. So you own all of the computers, you monitor all of that. You can also use the public cloud. So some of the most common examples of that are, say, AWS for Amazon Web Services, or Azure, which is the Microsoft competitor to that. There's also Google and IBM. All of those companies have their own public cloud offering. And for those, you actually go out to so Amazon and Microsoft and Google, all of them own their own data centers, and you're actually using the resources located inside those data centers. And then a hybrid cloud is a mix between the two. So say if you're, to use the tax example again, if you're keeping your tax data in a private cloud, but once a year when everyone sends in their tax forms and you suddenly need significantly more space, then you might, instead of utilizing your own additional resources, you might have just enough for day-to-day use in your private cloud. And so when you go past that point, you may expand into, say, the public cloud, or get resources from an additional location, and that's hybrid cloud.
Yeah, so far we have no questions. So while people start thinking about questions, let me ask you one question, Amanda. Because we noticed that the most of these governments is very reluctant to put their sensitive and critical data on the public cloud, and even sometimes they're not legally allowing it. So the most of our recommendations for deployment models were private cloud. So, but you also mentioned that this can be changed as things moving forward later on. So I want to hear again about your opinion on this type of data privacy issue.
So are you looking for what would need to change, or I'm afraid I don't fully
Need to change in what will be changed in the future. What's your opinion on how this can be changed in the future?
Fair enough. So I think governments are always going to be understandably concerned about data leaving their control. One of the things we definitely saw in Zambia and Serbia was that they were more interested in pursuing a local cloud provider option, but there weren't a lot of strong local cloud provider options for them to consider. So like in Zambia, the only local cloud provider that they could potentially look at, I think, was the MTN that we talked to, and they were in the process, if I remember correctly, of building the data center in Zambia. So that wasn't currently even an option. But it's really going to come down to what countries feel comfortable with. So the different cloud providers that they work with are going to have to be able to persuade them that they can meet whatever security rules that they have. And that's going to be a very individual experience for those countries, because every country is going to have different security rules and requirements. I mean, in the Philippines, they told us that if the data was classified, it shouldn't be digitized, which I think is something they're going to have to review as digitalization becomes more common. And when they reevaluate that, they're going to have to decide, what security they feel is required for which levels of data. A lot of the countries that we talked to hadn't really formalized kind of what what was classified data, what was personally identifiable information. So what data fell into what categories, and then what level of protection needed to be associated with those categories. And that's critical as they continue down this path.
So we still don't have any questions. So let me give you a quick announcement for the next step of this work. We are at the wrap-up stage now. We are trying to come up with good paragraphs for our copyright, and our intention is to put these materials on the World Bank website, so that anybody inside and outside the World Bank can have access to and use it necessary. So I guess it will be done probably by end of July also. So this participant today is more than welcome to the access to the materials and the toolkits that we are putting, and also to make the use of it. And if you have any questions and suggestions, you feel free to give me or Amanda and the emails or call. Amanda, do you have any final comments or anything to say?
No. Any feedback that people have, though, would definitely be appreciated.
Great, great. So thank you very much for your participation. And I think we have to close the webinar today. And before we do that, I'd like to tell you that, yeah. So please fill out the feedbacks that will be presented right after this presentation, so we can make a better the webinar series in the future. Thank you very much.